In an area right around the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, in the hills, at the base of one of those hills, serves as a perfect amphitheater for Jesus to be able to speak to a very large crowd. They had a seat around in the grass. He put his back to the mountain, or really a hill in our vocabulary, and he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you with utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." He goes on to say that we are the plan to bring about the kingdom of God, that we're called the salt of the earth, the light of the world. And then he makes this statement that's incredibly challenging for the hearers especially, but not so much as us today until we spend our time in it. He says in verse 20, "For I tell Texas slipped in. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." And when they heard that, they would have thought, "Oh my gosh, those are the most righteous, rule-keeping people I've ever seen. They are tied up with all of the rules and laws. They have made laws on top of laws. How could we ever exceed that kind of rule-keeping?" And Jesus says, actually, entering into the kingdom is so much more a matter of the heart than it is your hands or your feet. And he goes on to give 6 examples. 6 very specific, very tangible, real things that they're going to be wrestling with almost every day in what it looks like to enter into harmony with the kingdom of God. Last week we looked at anger. We said that you can't have the kind of anger that builds into contempt, because when you add anger and contempt together, you have hate. And that is incongruent with a kingdom mindset, an understanding of who we are in the kingdom. We have our work cut out for us tonight. We're going to work through 3 examples. I'm going to try to show you what these examples would have looked like in Jesus' day, and then rather than me give you specific applications, I'm going to take questions. We're going to allow you to text them in, or we'll take them through the microphone in those 3 areas. Those 3 areas for us will be lust, marriage and divorce, and oaths. Are you ready? This means yes. This means no. Are you ready? Okay, because we'll go back and read the Beatitudes again or something if we need to. Here we go. Verse 27. "You have heard it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now, this verse has caused a lot of heartache and sadness in a lot of us, because it seems to say that if we ever look in any direction and have any kind of thought about their beauty or their attractiveness or their sexiness, that we have immediately been condemned and might as well have gone over there and just had sex with them. In fact, when I first wrestled with becoming a Christian, no one shared this verse. Had they, I might have opted out. Except, is that really what Jesus is saying? What does it really mean here? Now, lust in Jesus' day. Let me read you a quote. This is a quote by Philip Yancey. Pharisees and teachers of the law competed with one another in their strictness. They had atomized God's law into 613 rules, 248 commandments, and 365 prohibitions, and then bolstered those with 1,521 emendations. To avoid breaking the third commandment, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord, they refused to pronounce the name of God at all. In fact, they wouldn't even write it. And if they did get to where they were going to write it, they would leave out parts of it, and they would go and cleanse themselves after writing each letter. Write a letter, leave, cleanse, come back. Write a letter, leave, cleanse, come back. To avoid sexual temptation, they had a practice of lowering their heads and not even looking at a woman. The most scrupulous of these were known as the bleeding Pharisees because of their frequent collisions with walls and other obstacles. They had taken this whole idea of keeping the rules to this high degree. But is that really what Jesus is saying? Look at it with me again. And tonight we're studying in the ESV version. It says there, I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent. Now the structure of that word there has a preposition in the front of it that basically means you look at a woman with desire to desire. The intent is to look at that woman or that man. Gals, you're not near off the hook here. To look at them with the intent of lust. Now that changes everything, doesn't it? Think about this. You could look at someone and say, wow, she's beautiful, and wow. And now you've got a choice. I didn't look at her with the intent of doing that. I didn't go to that situation with that. I'm actually in the state now of being tempted. And I've got a choice to make whether I'm going to allow my eyes to bounce off of that and not go back, or I'm going to stay there and wander there, and now my intent is to look with lust. Is that making sense? That every time if I were to just happen to look at a woman and it brings sex to my mind, does not mean that I have sinned. If I look at a woman and admire her beauty, it does not mean that I have sinned. It means that I am now on this thin ground, and by the way, that temptation from phase 1 to phase 2 happens in the nanoseconds. You've reached in this situation where you have the opportunity to be tempted, but you're not necessarily in sin yet. Let me show you what this looks like. Flip with me back to the book of James. It's back to the right, almost towards the end. James chapter 1. Let me show you what this looks like. Write this in on your notes because I don't think you'll find it there, this verse, if you'll go back and take a look at it later on. James 1. I'll start at verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. Very important principle there. We don't have time for it tonight. Look at this. But each one is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. So this whole process of being lured and enticed is temptation, not sin. The idea there with lured and enticed is actually a hunting term and a fishing term. It's the idea of dangling something in front of a fish or an animal, trying to lure them out of their safety and getting them into trouble. When that is going on, all of that is the temptation. But then when desire is conceived, in other words, you have decided to give into it, then it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Sin is one of those kind of crazy things. We think we want it, we really desire it, but whenever it comes into our lives, it usually costs us more than we thought it would, and it stays longer than we wished it would have. Jesus is not talking about temptation here, men and women. He's not talking about the kind of look that began with innocence. He's talking about the kind of look that began with an intent or stayed because of an intent. Is that making sense for you? Guys, let me show you. In a guy's world, here's what it looks like. 5 guys standing at the bar. Each woman that walks by gets rated. Wow, look at that. Look at those. She's a 8. She's a 4. What have you done? First of all, what you've done is reduced daughters, children that God cares for, to flesh that serve only for your gratification. But secondly, what you have done is you have looked with lustful intent. Every time someone visits pornography, I can't say every time, but it seems to me like 99% of the time when you go to pornography, you have gone with lustful intent. Gals, y'all do the same thing. I don't know if you stand at bars and rate us, and I don't want to know, but I'm sure something's going on. Anytime you go to a romance novel to escape, to be brought into something, a movie, any of those kinds of things, you have gone into those things with a lustful intent. And Jesus is saying right there, the state of your heart. The state of your heart. Notice what he said. You have committed adultery with her in your heart. Because the life in the kingdom is not simply a matter of keeping the rules. It's what's going on inside of your heart. It's the love and the expression of that love inside for other people that it should be developing as you live in harmony with the kingdom. And then he goes on to say some very difficult verses. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it's better to lose one of your members than it is the whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Do you believe that is really what he is trying to say? Wait a minute, he just said you have committed adultery in your heart. And if he wanted to really get to the heart of the matter, if that's what's going on, he would have said, cut out your heart. What is he saying there? I think it's a hyperbole. I think he's overstating to get your attention to say, this is really serious. To stand and develop such a lifestyle where you look at people with the intent of lust is so out of harmony, so completely out of harmony with what it looks like to live in the kingdom of God, that you better get serious if you've got this kind of thing going on in your head and in your heart. This is not that fleeting glance. This is not that, wow, look at that. This is where you go with the intent, or you stay with the intent of satisfying your own desires inside your mind and heart. Okay? Area 1, lust. Area 2, divorce. Now think of this. Think of the timing of where he's talked about. He's already said, imagine what our relationships would be if we didn't have anger or contempt or hatred or lust or sexual sins. Imagine how many divorces there would be. In my experience, I thought about this past week. How many divorces have I seen that didn't have to do with anger, contempt, hatred, or sex? I have to tell you, I can't think of any. And I'm around a lot of couples splitting up and asking me to referee. And I can't think of any. I'm sure there have been. I don't misunderstand. If you're out there and you're going, yeah, but, it's okay. I just don't know, or I forgot. Or it's just not as powerful as it serves my purposes here. Verse 31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. What does it look like in Jesus' day for divorce? Huge issue, humongous issue in Jesus' day. There were basically 2 yokes of thought. Remember what a yoke is. A yoke is the teachings of a rabbi, and when you were said to be under their yoke, when you agreed with their teachings. And so there were two main teachings around divorce. One guy was named Shammai, and Shammai believed that you could only divorce on moral grounds. Okay, and a group of people believed that that was consistent with what it taught in the Old Testament, which I believe as well, and that you shouldn't have done that way. But there was another rabbi, Hillel, who actually said you could divorce for any reason at all. Any displeasure in the husband's mind. By the way, the wife could never divorce in Jesus' day. Ever, ever, ever. So, what kinds of things? I did some research. I found one particular quote from a Rabbi Akiba that said, you can even divorce if you happen to be walking down the street and see another woman that looks better than your wife. Well, how many marriages would make it? Or gals too. Burning the food, over-salting the food. These are areas that I found of examples of why men divorce. They could absolutely write a certificate of divorce at any point. And what you do to a woman in Jesus' day when you do this, you've basically destined her to one of three options. All of the options are sorry. You give her a certificate of divorce, and all that certificate of divorce did was it released the man to go and marry again, and it tells the woman, you better carry this around, because if you get another husband and somebody knew you before, you're going to have to show this certificate to show you're not in an adulterous relationship. Here's your certificate of divorce. You burnt the stake. Now, what are the options that woman had in Jesus' day? She could go back home to her parents, which means parents did not want her back. It's not that they didn't still love their daughters, I'm sure. They didn't want her back, and she came back more in a slave kind of relationship, doing the lowest chores, than she came back really as a daughter again. She could remarry, but no guy wanted a non-virgin for their wife, except for the guys that couldn't get the virgins. So that she could remarry to guys that are sorry, and are usually treated sorry in those relationships. Or she could go to the one area in commerce that she could make a living at, and that was prostitution. The situation, in fact, one commentator said that marriage had gotten so bad for the woman that they were now refusing to marry. Which makes sense, right, gals? You're like, well, yeah. Because, they can take me, use me up, get rid of me in a couple of years, and then I'm left for nothing. And so gals were actually refusing to marry in this situation. And Jesus is saying, this should not be. This is not the kind of understanding of what marriage is. To think that it is just about your own gratifications, working it out and making you happy, misunderstands this wonderful mystery, this union that happens when two people come together and are married that become one flesh. When the man and the woman join together, God's math is 1 + 1 = 3. They're still together there, but there's this new entity of one flesh. And he says in there, it shouldn't be. Now, there's a lot of things that we could say about divorce, and some of the work that I hope that you'll do this week in the digging deeper, if you'll open up your handout, or actually not even open it up, just flip on the back, and there's some questions on day 3 about divorce. We give you a divorce, what we call the divorce triangle here, in terms of when is divorce biblical and allowed, and we've got it there with the verses, and you can work that way through. We've taught that before here. If there are questions about it, we'll bring it up in the Q&A. And just a way to kind of look at that. So Jesus says first, there should be a way where you should be concerned and understand that to reduce the opposite sex to just an object for your gratification is to misunderstand the identity that they have as an image bearer of God. To go into a covenant relationship of marriage just so that you can be satisfied and fulfilled and happy is to misunderstand the wonderful covenant relationship between a husband and wife. And it is to undermine the beauty of the spouse that you have. And then there's a third area, and he says it's oaths. Again, you have heard it said. Now, track with me on this, okay? So if you've kind of gone asleep or you're off on divorce, get back in on this one, because this one's a little bit different here. Again, you have heard it that it was said that to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is God's footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white, black, or to regrow. I would put in there. Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than that comes from evil. Now, work with me on this. Why do you swear to someone when you're talking to them? You're talking with them, and there's a situation going on, and they'll probably question you. Really? Is that true? And you might respond, swear. I swear it's true. I saw it with my own eyes. I swear it on my mother's life. I swear it on my kids. I swear it on my next paycheck. I swear. Right? Right? This is not talking about cussing, so get rid of that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about swearing. Now, why do you do that? You do that to help convince someone of the validity of your position. Right? Think this through. So what he's saying is that you're kind of doing this in such a way that you don't bring the kind of credibility that really proves the point. So in order to prove the point, you're going to swear by something to make this person think, wow, this is really, you're actually going to manipulate it in such a way where you're going to try to convince this person that you're telling the truth. We still tracking? So what I think Jesus is saying here is not so much that you shouldn't ever be under oath. I know that people have applied this and have refused to be in courtroom and have refused to be under oath. And other people take it to mean a number of different things. I don't believe that to be true. Jesus testified under oath. So did Paul in the New Testament. I don't think that's what it's talking about. I think it's talking about doing things in such a way where you're manipulating the situation to get your way. And the Pharisees had this thing down. I mean, this was unbelievable. The Pharisees had developed an elaborate system of oaths. They taught that by swearing by God's name was binding, but swearing by heaven and earth was not binding. Swearing towards Jerusalem was binding, but swearing by Jerusalem was not. In some cases, they even tried to deceive others by appealing to various authorities in their oath. Their purpose was negotiate and manipulate in a way that they got what they wanted. When you're talking to someone and if they say, I swear by Jerusalem. Well, if you were smart, you realize that didn't mean a thing because that's not binding. They had to face and say, I swear facing Jerusalem. Isn't that ridiculous? It's kind of ridiculous, right? But what he's saying, we have to understand what is Jesus saying in his day so that we can begin to understand what we're talking about now. And what I think he would say is, don't try to phrase things in such a way where you convince people of stuff that you want them to believe so you can get your way. Now, if you're in sales, this has tremendous ramifications. It does. But it also has for all of us. All of us, we're trying to convince someone that we're truthful and that they ought to buy into what we're saying. And many times we'll overstate that. And Jesus is saying, no, let your yes just be yes. Let your no be no. Don't manipulate. Don't push. Don't try to finagle in such a way that you just get your way. Now, in that day then, what does it look like to live in harmony with this kind of living? What does it look like for us today to live in this kind of living? Do we have the text number? Is it on? Oh, it's on the screen. Okay, so I see it. So you can text there any questions that came up about, and I'd like for you to keep them questions, first of all. This is not a chance to preach. I'd like for you to keep them inside the context of lust, divorce, and oaths. And let's go ahead if we want to. We can throw in anger in there too because we didn't get to do this last week. So a couple of ushers are going to come forward. If you don't text, we understand. And I don't want you to try to learn to text now because by the time you get it in, we're going to be praying for the offering. So we're going to be long gone. So we've got. So let's go to work together. Let's wrestle with this thing in terms of how it plays out, and if we got any questions upstairs, just let me know and shoot one up there when you have one. And you can raise your hand here if you'd just like to ask it out. Okay. How do we deal with a husband who uses pornography for his addiction? Based on what we just talked about, The person, follow this, because this is going to be, some of y'all are going to say, oh, I don't believe this and I don't agree with it. So I'm not the answer man. But my understanding of this passage means that if you go with lustful intent in a habitual way, you are involved in an adulterous relationship. So that where we once defined adulterous relationship, like one of our presidents did, there had to be penetration for it to have actually been sex. I'm saying no. To get the heart behind what Jesus is saying here, you've got an adulterous husband who's addicted to porn. Now, is he contrite about that? Does he acknowledge his addiction? And does he want to work on that and salvage his marriage? Then that's a completely different issue. And we think the divorce triangle is centered in Malachi, where it says God hates divorce. This is not an opportunity for more of you to get divorces because your husband viewed porn once 2 years ago. That's not the heart of this. And that's not the heart of what I'm saying. So don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm saying, though, if you have a husband who's unrepentant and he's in a pornography addiction and refuses to get rid of it, in my categories now, I see this as an adulterous relationship. And we need to treat it as such. We need to get him to admit that the addiction is there, and we need to be able to rally around him and hopefully get him some help. If he refuses to get help, then there's other things that we might try to do to get his attention. Good question. Tough. And there's no real good general answer. Each and every one of these really needs to be fleshed out with the couple, because there's different levels of repentance and there's different levels of rebellion. And again, if the person is contrite and they're trying to work on it and they're honest about what's going on and they've confessed their sin, I don't believe that that's a situation that you ought to begin to separate over. But certainly an addiction to porn that refuses to do anything about it, I believe you should start considering doing something to get his attention. It's an adulterous relationship, as I believe Jesus defined it. Okay. Now that's IMO, okay? IMHO. In my humble opinion. Okay? All right. Oh, we've got another one. Just get your hand up here. If you have a deeply emotional connection with a married person, is that considered adultery? Well, you didn't give me enough information for me to answer the question. There are some things that really you should only have satisfied and have an emotional connection that is from your spouse. So if this is a kind of a connection that is it's becoming romantic in nature and not a friendship in nature, again, even though it's romantic in nature, even though there has not been the actual act of sex, it might be moving into an adulterous relationship. I don't have enough information. And again, all of these questions that are around this, I would want to meet with the individuals to make sure that we talked about it. Question over here? Okay.
In the cases of divorce, what about when the couple gets married, everything's fine, and they're both Christians or whatever, and now it's become a case of domestic violence where the husband beats the wife every night or something like that? Can you get a divorce for that? It's not one of the sexually unfaithful, deserted, or before salvation.
Yeah, it's not one of the sections there, but what's happened is that first, I got a problem with a Christian who beats his wife. Okay? So right away, I'm going to question the validity of their faith and whether it's a real situation or not. And if it's not a real situation or not, then I'm moving towards desertion if that person is and I'm never going to get a woman into a situation that's not safe. So immediately, I'm going to get the gal out of that relationship, out of the home, or get the guy out of the home so that woman's safe. And then we're going to work from there. And Jesus says you can know a tree by its fruit. And a man who beats his wife on a regular basis is a pretty bad fruited tree. So the reality of Jesus in that kind of a situation, I'm not saying a guy can't ever lose his temper and do something stupid, which is inexcusable, but could happen and still be a believer. But habitually non-safe violence like that, we got an issue. And so then we'll go to 1 Corinthians 7 and deal with him as an unbeliever, because that's what he's acting like. But again, every decision, every case individual. Don't take this and run and tell your best friend, Steve says, Steve says maybe talk to Steve. That's what Steve says. Question upstairs? Okay. What about divorce and remarriage? Is remarriage allowed? What if you marry a divorced person? Are you an adulterer? The divorce and remarriage issue is handled by the divorce triangle. What I can tell you for certain is that if you were married and divorced before you were a believer, based on 2 Corinthians 5, that is not binding for your future marriages. If you are married to someone who is sexually unfaithful, Matthew 5, Matthew 19, there's grounds there. Apparently, Jesus has given those exception clauses about when you can remarry. And if you're married to an unbeliever and that unbeliever leaves you or asks you to leave, then you're free to remarry. The rest of the cases we've got to deal with on an individual basis and try to figure something out. Again, inside the context of Malachi 2, men and women, God hates divorce. Okay. All right. Other question in here or upstairs? Yep, right here.
What kind of limits could you set in a relationship, such as a parent who is not taking responsibility for their anger during misunderstandings?
Ask me again. Ask it again. Limits?
What kind of limits could you set with a parent who isn't taking responsibility for their part during misunderstandings in terms of anger?
Okay. What kind of limits can you put on a situation like with a parent and they're still expressing anger to you? First, the very first limit is the anger expressed in such a way where it's harmful to somebody? And then in that situation, I immediately try to get people safe. And so that limit is right there. The second part is it's very difficult in situations with anger. Sometimes the person will not admit there's an anger problem. So until somebody wants help, you can't get help. So our job then is to try to convince them that there's an anger issue. And once they do that, then we've got avenues to begin to do that. We actually have a class that we're thinking about offering this fall at some point on anger. There's a lot of good material out there, and there's some great counseling available in the city. But you can't get there unless someone will admit they're having a problem. The truth of the matter is, and this sounds terrible, but if one or the other lashes out in physical violence, we immediately have grounds for now getting after it. Some of the most destructive anger is that verbal, mental kind of hammering on people that you don't have any evidence to get things moving forward, and they won't admit that there's anger. Is that helpful? Upstairs? Okay. How do you respond to a girlfriend, future wife, who wants to know everything you have looked with lust at in your heart? Y'all come on in and talk to me. My response would be, we're told to speak the truth in love, but there are times when the whole truth is not love. And so I'm not saying lie. I'm saying maybe you just don't bring the whole truth to bear. Will it really help you be a better couple in the future to know that at 16 you saw your first penthouse? At 18 you bought your first Hustler. I don't even know is Hustler still a magazine? That was my experience way back when. Is it? Nobody wants to say yes. Good job, good job. I almost got you. But some of that information's not, it's also some of the sexual activity you had before you were married. Some of that, full disclosure is maybe not always healthy. But she has certainly a right to know some of the things that have gone on and what she's getting herself into. Because based on the nature of sexually transmitted diseases, that's a question. If I were to marry somebody today that had an active sex life in their past and now had become a Christian and we were going to get married, which we're not, but if I'm just saying, I would say let's both go get an AIDS test. Let's go get it done. Let's move forward with confidence. Because the truth of the matter is that thing can lay dormant for 6, 7, 8 years and not manifest itself until then. And if you're active, if you were active and you blew it, and now you're a believer and you've got that, you're trying to get that under control and you're engaged, I think that's a legitimate request for this kind of a person to make. Is there another one upstairs? Because I got one more minute. Oh, we got one down here then. Right here.
Spouse divorces on the basis of unhappiness and affair of the heart, but still claims to be a Christian. Divorce then concludes. Am I then free to find someone else?
Again, I would want to sit down and get more particulars than this, but there are times, and I'm not saying that you're guiltless, but there are times when you can't stop a divorce from happening. And how we move forward with that would be a time when we would deal. That's when I said it right there, when I said, here's the things I know for sure, and the rest we'll have to talk about. Those are the kinds of things that we would have to talk about, and we'd have to know, what was your part in this? What does that mean? The truth of the matter is that sometimes you have a divorce and you were the cause of what went on. You're not free to remarry. That's our position here. I know that bugs some of you. Now, you can go get married and do whatever you want, but we wouldn't do the wedding here. Because you were the one that had the adulterous affair. You were the one that caused the divorce to happen in the first place. Now, until that spouse that's now your ex goes and remarries and is now in another relationship, and then, of course, then you've got some freedom to kind of move forward from there. But individually, we'd have to wrestle with it. I wish I could give you a little bit clearer deal. Okay, this is what I'd hoped. I'd hoped that I got to the point where I said, okay, I could come up with these kinds of things, and when does look become a lust, and when is divorce okay? And I could talk through that. If you need more information, there's a number of different series that we've done. I wrote some of them down. There's Porn Sundays. We've done some Porn Sunday weekends in the fall. 07 would be a great one to go back. In September of 07, you can go back on the website and just grab that. We did a series called 7, the 7 Deadly Sins. And we did a week on lust, and we tried to handle it in a much broader way. We also did the 1 Corinthians series just recently, the letter to the jacked up church, the section that was called The Elephant in the Room. You guys, some of y'all remember, where we talked extensively about marriage and divorce and lust and those kinds of things. I thought it might be more beneficial. I hope it worked for you, that we would do it in such a way where instead of doing it that way again, I would just kind of open it up. If you have feedback for me in terms of this, I'm going to do it 3 more times, and thank you for sitting through the experiment. And if there's some feedback that you can give me in terms of moving forward, I'm open to that as well. Let me pray for us. And then some things may have been stirred up and you're now aware. And I would say, if you're in a situation, Jesus says these kinds of matters of the heart are incredibly important. It's like cutting off your hand to get it fixed. It's like gouging out an eye. If you're here and don't feel like, oh my gosh, God is so angry with me that I could never have a relationship with him, the reality of what Jesus Christ offers to us is hope and forgiveness, but it's followed with a desire to repent and move forward. And this would be a time, Mark's designed a time where we could sit with this and say, God, here I am. What would you like to do in my life? How would you like to lead me in such a way so that I can hand off to you everything and you can have your way in my life? Let me pray for you and then we'll engage in that. God, thank you for the comfort of your forgiveness and also the clarity of your expectations for us. May we not take sin lightly. I pray for those that are in a lust. They look with intent for lust on a regular basis, God. They are in dangerous waters. I pray, God, that they would get serious about it and they would get community around them and they would get free of it. Marriages that are in trouble, and also those who have recently been divorced that are hurting and questioning what's going on. I pray, God, your Spirit would pour peace into their lives. And God, I pray we'd be a people that our yes is a yes and our no is a no, even when it hurts us, for the kingdom's sake. Thank you for Jesus. We pray in his name. Amen.